The fluorescent lights of Martinez Grocery buzzed overhead as Ethan Reeves stood in line, absently thumbing through his phone. It was a Tuesday evening, and the small neighborhood store was busier than usual, filled with the after-work crowd rushing to grab last-minute ingredients for dinner. Ethan glanced up, his gaze landing on the elderly woman in front of him. She was fumbling with her purse, a worried crease between her brows. As the cashier began scanning her items, the woman's movements became more frantic. Ethan watched as she pulled out a small change purse, counting out coins with trembling fingers. His heart sank as he realized she was coming up short. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice quavering. "I must have miscalculated. Could you remove the chicken, please? And the vegetables?" The cashier nodded sympathetically, reaching for the items. Without thinking, Ethan stepped forward. "Wait," he said, pulling out his wallet. "I've got this." The woman turned, startled. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly—" "Please," Ethan insisted, already handing his credit card to the cashier. "It's no trouble." As the transaction went through, Ethan caught a glimpse of the woman's face. There was something familiar about her eyes, a shade of green he couldn't quite place. He shook off the feeling, chalking it up to déjà vu. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to me." Ethan smiled, helping her gather her bags. "It's my pleasure, really. I'm Ethan, by the way." "Margaret," she replied, offering a tremulous smile. "Margaret Holloway." The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. He stumbled, nearly dropping the bag he was holding. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked, concern etching her features. Ethan nodded, trying to regain his composure. "Yes, I'm fine. It's just, that was my mother's name." Margaret's eyes widened. "Was? She left when I was a baby?" Ethan explained, not sure why he was sharing this with a stranger. "I never knew her." A charged silence fell between them. Margaret clutched her grocery bags tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the store's ambient noise. "What's your last name?" He met her gaze, suddenly aware of why her eyes had seemed so familiar. They were his eyes, staring back at him from an older face. "Reeves," he said, his heart pounding. "Ethan Reeves." Margaret gasped, the color draining from her face. The grocery bags slipped from her grasp, cans and produce spilling across the linoleum floor. "Oh my God," she breathed. "It's you. It's really you." Ethan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what was happening. This woman, this stranger he'd impulsively helped, was claiming to be the mother who had abandoned him 35 years ago. "I don't understand," he managed, his voice hoarse. Why? Margaret reached out a trembling hand, stopping just short of touching his face. "I never thought I'd see you again. I've imagined this moment so many times, but I never dreamed it would happen like this." The store around them faded away as Ethan stared at the woman who had given him life, then vanished from it. A whirlwind of emotions swept through him: anger, confusion, longing, and a desperate, aching need for answers. "We need to talk," he said finally, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "There's a coffee shop next door. Will you join me?" Margaret nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Yes, of course." As they gathered the fallen groceries and made their way out of the store, Ethan's mind raced. He had spent years imagining this scenario, crafting speeches and hurling accusations at the phantom of his absent mother. But now, faced with the reality of her presence, he found himself at a loss for words. The coffee shop was a cozy affair, with mismatched furniture and the rich aroma of freshly ground beans. They settled into a quiet corner, two steaming mugs between them. For a long moment, neither spoke, the weight of 3.5 decades of separation hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. "I owe you an explanation," she said softly. "I know that nothing I say can make up for what I did, but you deserve to know the truth." Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He watched as Margaret took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly around her mug. "I was young when I had you," she began. "Barely 20. Your father and I, we thought we were ready for a family, but we were just kids ourselves. When you came along, it was overwhelming. I struggled with postpartum depression, though I didn't know that's what it was at the time. I felt like I was drowning, like I couldn't breathe. This arrived at my apartment yesterday." Frowning, Ethan opened the envelope. Inside were several photographs, all of him and Margaret. There were shots of them leaving the grocery store that first night, sitting in the coffee shop, walking in the park. Along with the photos was a handwritten note. "I know your secret. Meet me at the old pier tomorrow at midnight, or everyone will know what you did." Ethan looked up, confusion and alarm warring on his face. "What is this? Who sent these? And what secret are they talking about?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "It's not about us reuniting, Ethan. It's about what really happened the night I left." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. "What do you mean? I thought you told me everything." Margaret shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I lied. I didn't just leave that night. Something terrible happened." Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Tell me." Taking a shaky breath, Margaret began to speak. "That night, your father and I had a huge fight. He'd been drinking, which wasn't unusual back then. He was angry about something trivial. I don't even remember what now, but he wouldn't let it go. He followed me into the nursery where you were sleeping, still yelling." She paused, closing her eyes as if in pain. "I was trying to quiet him, afraid he'd wake you up. But he just got angrier. He shoved me. I lost my balance and fell against your crib. It tipped over." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. "What are you saying?" "You fell out," Margaret continued, her voice hollow. "Hit your head on the floor. There was so much blood. I was sure you were dead. Your father, he panicked. Said we had to cover it up, make it look like an accident. But I couldn't. I ran. I just ran and never looked back." Ethan sat in stunned silence, trying to process this revelation. His entire understanding of his childhood, of his parents, was crumbling around him. "But I survived," he said finally. "I don't have any memory of this. No scars." Margaret nodded. "I found out years later that you had recovered. Your father had taken you to the hospital, claimed you'd fallen out of your crib while he was in the other room. By then, I was too ashamed to come back. I convinced myself you were better off without me." Ethan's mind reeled. The father he had idolized, the man who had raised him alone and been his hero, had lied to him his entire life. And now, someone knew the truth and was threatening to expose it all. "We have to go to the police," Ethan said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Margaret's eyes widened in fear. "We can't." "Your father, he could go to jail. And I left you there. I'm just as guilty." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, feeling the world tilt on its axis. "Then what do? We can't give in to blackmail." Before Margaret could respond, Ethan's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, then froze. "What is it?" Margaret asked, alarmed by his expression. Wordlessly, Ethan turned the phone so she could see the screen. It was a photo of a man, Ethan's father, lying unconscious on what looked like a concrete floor. The message beneath read, "Time's up. Pier. Now." Without a word, Ethan and Margaret rushed out of the coffee shop, leaving their untouched drinks behind. As they hurried towards the waterfront, the weight of their shared past and the uncertainty of their future hung heavy between them. The old pier loomed before them, a dilapidated structure jutting out into the dark water. The sound of waves lapping against weathered wood filled the air, punctuated by the distant cry of seagulls. Ethan's heart raced as they approached, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "We're here. Show yourself." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "Robert?" "But why? Why?" Robert's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "Because it's time the truth came out. Time for everyone to know what kind of people you really are." Ethan's mind raced, trying to make sense of this new development. "Where's my father? What have you done with him?" Robert waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, he's fine. Sleeping off a little cocktail I slipped him earlier. He's safely tucked away in my boat. I thought he should be here for the big reveal." "What reveal?" Ethan demanded, taking a step forward. "What is this all about?" Robert's eyes glittered dangerous. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a figure emerged from behind a stack of old crates. Ethan squinted in the dim light, trying to make out the person's features. As the stranger stepped closer, recognition dawned, and Ethan felt his world tilt once again. "Uncle Rob?" he gasped, staring at his father's younger brother in disbelief. Robert Reeves stepped fully into view, a sardonic smile twisting his features. "Hello, nephew, Margaret. So glad you could join us." "Why?" Robert's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "Because it's time the truth came out. Time for everyone to know what kind of people you really are." Ethan's mind raced, trying to make sense of this new development. "Where's my father? What have you done with him?" Robert waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, he's fine. Sleeping off a little cocktail I slipped him earlier. He's safely tucked away in my boat. I thought he should be here for the big reveal." "What reveal?" Ethan demanded, taking a step forward. "What is this all about?" Robert's eyes glittered dangerously in the moonlight. "It's about justice, Ethan. Justice for the brother I lost that night 35 years ago." Confusion clouded Ethan's features. "What are you talking about? My father's alive." "Is he?" Robert countered. "The man who raised you, sure. But my real brother? The kind, gentle soul I grew up with. He died the night your precious mother here decided to run away and leave you for dead." Margaret flinched at his words, but Robert wasn't finished. "Do you have any idea what it was like? Watching my brother spiral into alcoholism and depression. Raising a child he thought he'd nearly killed. Seeing him twist himself into knots trying to be the perfect father to make up for a crime he thought he'd committed." Ethan's head spun with this new information. "But if you knew the truth, why didn't you ever say anything?" Robert laughed bitterly. "And ruin the masterpiece of martyrdom my dear brother had created?" "I tried at first. But he was so convinced of his own guilt, so determined to atone that he wouldn't hear it. And you worshipped the ground he walked on. How could I take that away from either of you?" "So instead you've spent decades plotting revenge?" Ethan asked incredulously. "Not revenge," Robert corrected. "Justice. I wanted you all to face the consequences of your actions. Margaret for abandoning her child. My brother for living a lie. And you, Ethan, for being the unwitting catalyst that destroyed our family." Margaret stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Robert, please, we can talk about this. There's no need to—" Her words were cut off by the sound of slow, mocking applause. All three turned to see a new figure emerging from the shadows at the far end of the pier. "Bravo," said a familiar voice. "What a touching family reunion." Ethan's father, looking disheveled but very much awake, walked towards them with measured steps. "Dad?" Ethan breathed, relief and confusion warring in his voice. George Reeves ignored his son, his gaze fixed on his brother. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice you slipping something into my drink, Rob? I've spent the last 35 years fighting the bottle. You think I don't know what it feels like to be drugged?" Robert's composure cracked for the first time. "But how?" George's smile was grim. "I played along, followed you here. I wanted to see what you were really up to." His eyes swept over Ethan and Margaret. "Seems I'm not the only one with secrets." The tension on the pier was palpable, the air thick with decades of secrets and lies. Ethan felt as though he were watching a play unfold, the characters all too familiar yet suddenly strange to him. "So," George said, his voice unnaturally calm. "You've all been busy while I was supposedly unconscious. Care to fill me in on what I've missed?" No one spoke. The only sound was the gentle lapping of waves against the pier and the distant cry of a lonely seagull. "No takers?" George pressed, his eyes hard. "Then allow me to summarize. My wife, who I believed dead for 35 years, is alive and has been secretly meeting with our son. My brother, whom I trusted above all others, has been plotting some twisted form of justice. And my son..." He turned to Ethan, his expression unreadable. "What's your role in all this, Ethan?" Ethan swallowed hard, feeling like a child again under his father's scrutiny. I just wanted to know the truth, Dad. About Mom. About what happened that night." George's laugh was hollow. "The truth? You want the truth? Fine. Let's have it all out then, shall we?" He turned to Margaret, his eyes blazing. "You start. Tell our son exactly why you left that night." Margaret flinched, but stood her ground. "I've already told him, George, about our fight, about the accident with the crib, how I thought..." Her voice broke. "How I thought I'd killed our baby." George's face contorted with a mixture of pain and fury. "Is that what you've been telling yourself all these years? That you ran because you thought Ethan was dead? Tell him the rest, Margaret. Tell him why you really left." Confusion clouded Margaret's features. "What are you talking about?" "The letter!" George roared, causing everyone to take a step back. "The letter you left on the kitchen table. The one where you said you couldn't handle being a mother anymore, that you were leaving us for good. The one where you said you never loved me, that our marriage was a mistake." Ethan turned to Margaret, his world tilting once again. "Is this true?" Margaret shook her head vehemently. "No, I never wrote any letter. George, what are you talking about?" "Don't lie." George's voice cracked with emotion. "I read it 100 times, memorized every word. It's what kept me going all these years, knowing that you chose to leave us." Robert stepped forward, his earlier bravado replaced by genuine confusion. "George, there was never any letter. I was there that night, remember? After Margaret left, when you called me in a panic, there was no letter." George's certainty seemed to waver for the first time. "But I saw it. I read it. It was there on the table next to her wedding ring." A heavy silence fell over the group as the implications of this revelation sank in. Ethan's mind raced, trying to piece together this new information with everything he thought he knew about his past. "If Mom didn't write the letter," he said slowly, "then who did?" All eyes turned to Robert, who held up his hands defensively. "Don't look at me. I had nothing to do with this." "Then who?" George demanded, his voice hoarse. "Who would have..." His words trailed off as his gaze landed on something behind Ethan. Following his father's line of sight, Ethan turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows at the far end of the pier. "I think," said a familiar voice, "it's time I added my part to this family drama." Ethan's Aunt Catherine, his father's sister, stepped into the dim light cast by the pier's lone lamp. In her hand, she held a yellowed envelope. "Kathy," George whispered, disbelief etched on his face. "What are you doing here?" Catherine's smile was sad as she approached the group. "Tying up loose ends, dear brother. It's time this charade came to an end." She held out the envelope to George, who took it with trembling hands. "You might recognize this. It's the letter you've been carrying around in your heart for 35 years. George stared at the envelope, then back at his sister. "I don't understand. How do you have this?" "Because," Catherine said softly, "I wrote it." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Ethan watched as his father staggered back, shock and betrayal warring on his face. "You?" George breathed. "But why?" Catherine's composure cracked, tears welling in her eyes. "Because I loved you, George. I loved you in a way a sister never should, and I couldn't bear to see you trapped in a marriage with a woman who didn't appreciate you, who was struggling with motherhood." She turned to Margaret, her expression pleading. "I saw how you were suffering, how unhappy you both were. I thought if you left, I could help George raise Ethan. We could be the family I always dreamed of." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan felt as though the ground beneath his feet had disappeared, leaving him suspended in a void where nothing made sense anymore. It was Robert who finally broke the silence, laughing mirthlessly. "Well, isn't this rich? All these years, I thought I was the one with the master plan. Turns out I was just another pawn in a game I didn't even know was being played." George turned to his brother, his voice barely above a whisper. "You knew? All this time, you knew Margaret hadn't abandoned us?" Robert nodded, the fight seeming to drain out of him. "I suspected. The Margaret I knew would never have left a letter like that. But by the time I realized what might have happened, you were so convinced of her betrayal, so dedicated to raising Ethan alone, that I didn't know how to tell you the truth." Ethan's head spun as he tried to process this cascade of revelations. His entire life, everything he thought he knew about his family and himself, had been built on a foundation of lies and misunderstandings. He turned to his mother, seeing her in a new light. "So you really did think I was dead? That's why you ran?" Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was so scared, so overwhelmed. I convinced myself that running was the only option. By the time I learned you had survived, years had passed. I thought you were better off without me." George took a tentative step towards his long-lost wife, his anger seeming to deflate. "I would have forgiven you, Maggie. If you had come back, explained what happened, I would have forgiven you anything." Margaret's sob caught in her throat. "I didn't think I deserved forgiveness. I still don't." As Ethan watched his parents, separated for decades by a web of lies and misunderstandings, he felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to bridge the gap between them. Without thinking, he stepped forward, taking each of their hands in his own. "Maybe," he said softly, "it's time we all learned how to forgive, not just each other, but ourselves too." The simple gesture seemed to break a dam. George pulled Margaret into a fierce embrace, both of them weeping openly. Robert slumped against a nearby post, the weight of his years-long deception finally lifting from his shoulders. And Catherine stood apart, her expression a mixture of relief and regret, as she watched the family she had both fractured and inadvertently reunited. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, Ethan found himself at the center of a group hug, surrounded by the flawed, complicated people who made up his family. There was still so much to process, so many wounds to heal, but for the first time in his life, he felt truly whole. The kind stranger who had paid for a woman's groceries had indeed found his long-lost mother, but he had found so much more than that. He had uncovered the truth of his past, confronted the lies that had shaped his life, and in doing so, had opened the door to a future filled with the possibility of genuine love and understanding. As they all walked off the pier together, leaving behind the weight of decades of secrets, Ethan realized that sometimes the most extraordinary acts of kindness can lead to the most unexpected and transformative journeys of all.